Lord. So good for me. The Fultz has just shown up, so glad to see them here. There you go. All righty, tonight we're beginning Matthew chapter 23. We have, after this class and two more classes, and that's it. As I said, I will be sending out the final here before long, and I'm thinking seriously about the final, maybe something like maybe 5 or 6 essay questions, so that I can know what you've learned in that respect. They're harder to grade, but I'm also more lenient in those respects. So keep that in mind. If you're taking these for credit, just keep that in mind as well. Before we begin, let's pray. Grateful to you, Father, for this day and for the blessings you give us. I pray, asking you to please be with us as we enter into this time of study. Help us, Lord, to grow closer to you and closer to one another. Help us to realize what a precious treasure we have in the church. And then the fact, Lord, that you love us as much as you do. We are so grateful to you for your grace. We ask you, Father, that your grace will motivate us and your love will motivate us to greater service, to greater Christian living, to a closer walk with you each and every day. I'm grateful for these students, and I pray your richest blessings upon them as they study with me and as we're trying to study together what your word says. Thank you, Lord, for all you do for us. In Jesus' name, amen. We are in the last week of Jesus' life. We've come now to Matthew chapter 23. This will be his last public discourse, and this particular discourse will go on as he will talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in more detail, as well as discuss the idea in a little bit more detail. He'll also emphasize the idea of what's going to happen at the very end of time for his death, or after his death, whenever we're going to meet the Lord together with him in the air. So in Matthew chapter 23, he's speaking, and like I said, in this last public discourse at the temple to his disciples as well as the multitudes. And this is what we call the woe chapter. In this chapter, you have 8 different 8 woes in this chapter where he condemns the Pharisees and what they're doing. I like to think of this particular sermon as it was as a last-ditched effort to try to help them to see where their thinking has taken them. And sometimes we all need those kind of sermons. We all need those sermons that kind of remind us, okay, maybe I'm not exactly where I do need to be. Sometimes we get to thinking, I think, that maybe we're okay. I have no doubt that the Pharisees of that day, we know that. Back in John chapter 7, he said, these people that know not the law are accursed. So they looked at themselves as being the only ones that were going to make it. Sometimes we can go to that extreme too. So let's listen to what he says. And I submit unto you that as we listen to this, we're not looking at it just from the viewpoint of his condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees, but also some of the things here may somewhat bother us a little bit. And I'm challenging us not from the viewpoint of trying to condemn us, but trying, as Jesus did, hopefully to get us to see where we need to change our lives. He said, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. That was the seat that was considered to be the judgment seat at that time. He says, so therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not. They talk about what everybody else needs to be doing, but in a lot of situations, as we're going to see in this chapter, Jesus said they're not even living up to their own standards. That's called hypocrisy. And that's one of the things that I think so many people in the world today find a fault with the Lord's church, is the fact that, and a lot of times, don't get me wrong, a lot of times people dismiss the church by saying, well, they're just it's just a bunch of hypocrites there. But, hold on just a second. But there's more to it than just that. We can't just dismiss the church because of that reason, but we must be better than that. So he says, he's going to give us some examples. They bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. They will, again, some of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were known as the separated ones. That's kind of what the term meant. So they said, you have to do these certain things to do this. And they would make laws around the laws as I've shared with you before, in an effort to try to keep them from breaking the Old Testament law. How much can you carry on the Sabbath day journey of 7/8 of a mile? What exactly could you do in that respect? And everybody is now dealing with so many rules and regulations that now even trying to live for God is kind of what? It was kind of a situation where why try? Because we're never going to be able to reach up to this. So he says they're laying heavy burdens hard on and lay them on men's shoulders, but they will not move them with one of their fingers. He says, but all their works they do to be seen by men. So you see, they're claiming to be followers of God. They will pray. He will emphasize in the street corners where everybody will talk about their piety. Go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. But he says, their prayers don't get any higher than that. So he goes on. They make their phylacteries broad. The phylactery was a small piece of parchment or vellum that had certain passages of Scripture written on it. For example, they might be writing Exodus 13, 3 through 16, or mostly they would use the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. And it would be enclosed in a leather case. So it would be kind of a leather box that they would have right around their forehead, and they would walk around wearing that. And they would wear it as an amulet or a charm, or, especially they would wear it at prayer time. Sometimes they would do it on the left arm, and it would actually be from the top of the elbow to the top of the middle finger, and they could just sit there and look at it, okay? And so they perhaps made these phylacteries broad so everybody see, well, these people are really trying to do what God wants them to do, and they're doing it not for the purpose. God knows our hearts. He's not there to look and see how many scriptures we've memorized and all. He's looking at our heart and seeing if we're living up to what he has told us to understand and obey. And so you see, they enlarge the borders of their garments. Enlarging the border of their garments, a lot of times we remember that as the priest would go into the tabernacle, they would have to wear a certain priestly garment, and they would have bells around the hem. So a lot of the Pharisees would enlarge the borders of their garments, and with the bells or something like that, even if they may not have been of the priestly sect, simply because they want people to understand that they're trying to be what everybody else that agreed with them wanted them to be. He said they made the best places at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue. He said they loved greeting in the marketplace, being called rabbi, rabbi, teacher, teacher. We're in Matthew chapter 23, brother. All righty. He said, but you do not be worried about being called a rabbi or teacher, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren. So he says, don't call yourselves by special names, A lot of times people call it Pastor Tommy. No, I'm just Tommy, okay? Of course, they use that from a term viewpoint that the preacher sometimes is the pastor, as their ideal is. 1 Timothy chapter 3, Acts chapter 6, and so forth talks about the elders being a pastor. Poimen is that Greek word there. So he says, don't call anyone on earth your father. Okay, there's a whole group of people, a whole denomination that does a lot of that, so we've got to keep that in mind. And he says, do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, Christ. And the idea of the thing Jesus is getting across here in Matthew chapter 23 is the idea that we should not be looking for special names to glorify us as much as we're trying to glorify the Father. So he says, you have one Father, and that Father is the Father in heaven. And he says, do not be called teachers, for again, one is your teacher, the Christ. He who is greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself will be exalted. And so you see, he's telling them up front, don't be like the Pharisees are striving to be. Now we actually get into the 8 woes of Matthew chapter 23. He said, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And again, the word hypokrites means to act upon. And so I've always reminded myself, and whenever I'm teaching this class, I always remind myself the idea that particular Greek word suggests the idea of an actor. So all the folks you see on television are all hypocrites. Just keep that in mind. That's the way to always keep that in mind, all right? That's a simple way to do it. He says, now hear what they do, verse 13. You shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, and you neither go in, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. In other words, you are keeping people from the kingdom. Your hypocrisy was keeping them from the kingdom. So he says, number one, the first thing you do is you shut up the kingdom. Why? Well, they're binding burdens on others that they themselves wouldn't bear. They wanted to receive the praise of men. Now they're blocking the entrance to the kingdom of God by their hypocrisy. He goes on. He says, you devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore you will receive the greater condemnation. Devour widows' houses suggests the idea that they're stealing from those who need the money the most. Think about how often today the same characteristics that he's describing here can fit so many of the TV preachers and things along that line. They took advantage of widows. And again, under the Old Testament, God was very specific that he looks out for the widows and the orphans. And again, we must as well. He goes on. Now, right here in Matthew chapter 23, verse 14, he goes further. Now, Mark and Luke leave this section out, okay? But it's interesting when you're starting to compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke and all of this, they're leaving that out. So he goes further. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. By the way, before we go any further, why do you think they leave it out when Matthew's so hard on them? Because, well, he understood, but also he was writing to the Jews. And so the Jews would understand more of this than maybe Mark and Luke's readers would understand because they're mainly from a Gentile context. So he says, you travel land and sea to make one proselyte. And then once you make him twice the son of hell than you yourself are. So they abuse these people that they convert to their way of thinking. They abuse them in some way or another. And again, talk about, well, you might one of these days gain the superior knowledge that you need to be what you need to be. Again, it's all about people. He says, you blind guides. Woe to you, blind guides, who say whoever swears by the temple, it's nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. And Jesus asked a question. He said, let's think this thing through a little bit. What sanctifies the temple, the gold on the temple or the temple itself? The temple is where God is. And so the reality is that the temple sanctifies the gold, not the gold on the temple. I mean, use your brains a little bit. And so what does he call them? Fools and blind. Again, does that contradict what Jesus said? Don't call anybody a fool? No. He's trying his best, like I said at the very beginning, he's trying his best to get these people to open up their eyes to what they're doing. And again, as you're reading through this and looking through this, just keep in mind that many of these applications can fit for us today. We've got to look at ourselves honestly. Whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he's obliged to perform it. Okay, again, the same question. What's greater, the altar or the gift? Obviously, the gift on the altar, right? Because that's what they're giving God. And he says, you're swearing by the altar. So if you swear by the altar, you're swearing by the altar. But if you swear by the gift, you're swearing by it. And he says, all things on it. Whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. So here's what he's saying. You're taking God's name in vain by doing that. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin. Now, all of these were herbs that had a very fine aromatic quality, but they were little value. So they will make sure that they pay tithes of all of these little things and make sure, and they pride themselves in their details, but they neglect the weightier matters of the law. So he says, you neglect justice. What is justice from a biblical viewpoint?
Justice is honoring the law and living out the law before the people. As you honor the law, you honor God.
Right. And it also suggests the idea, part of that would be treating one another like we're all of the human race, because we are. We all are of one race, the human race. God made us that way. And again, we need not to look at somebody's skin or the way they talk or where they come from. We need to look at them as a viewpoint. And hopefully we could get this idea, because we're Christians, we look at these as people created by God that have a soul that's going to live through eternity. So we have to be very careful about this. Justice, we treat everybody the same, no matter what. Mercy, what is mercy? Compassion. Showing compassion to the widows that need that help. Compassion to the sinner that's trying to do better. Compassion to whoever needs that. Sometimes the world needs a lot less judgment and a lot more compassion. And I think and again, that we have to understand that judgment has to be according to the law. And then he says you need to have more faith. I think all of us will agree with that, right? Faith comes by hearing by the word of God. We grow in faith the more we study. And that's why I've appreciated you guys studying this class with me on the life of Christ. And I hope it's built your faith. And maybe you've looked at Jesus differently than maybe you have in times past. If that's what happens, then I've succeeded in my teaching. And that's really what it's all about. He said you ought to have taken care of the small details without leaving the other things undone. Blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. That's a figure of speech that we're sitting there thinking to ourselves, but again, it makes so much sense. We're so picky about the small stuff, and in the meantime, a camel can walk into the room and we're not paying attention to it. And that's exactly what Jesus was saying. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Okay? You know, we live in the land of dishwashers, or even our husbands and wives wash the dishes, and we clean the inside of the plate, we clean the outside of the plate, right? They would clean the outside. He said, that's like you guys. You've got all this food on this plate, but you're cleaning the outside, you're not cleaning the inside. The emphasis is what? Our hearts. And God looks on the heart. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. 1 Samuel chapter 16, where he talks about David. All righty? So cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, and the outside may be clean also. He said, you're like whitewashed tombs. All right? So whitewashed tombs, again, remember part of the things that the Jews had. They could not be around a dead body or get near a dead body, because that would make them unclean for a period of 7 days. All right? They couldn't really worship. They would not be allowed to worship in those circumstances. Go back and read where under the Passover, there were some men on that very first Passover right there at the Mount Sinai. They said, well, we've not been able to participate because we helped bury a body. And so the rule was, according to the Numbers, if you were unclean during that time when they took the first Passover, you could take it 1 month later at the same time. So that's the reason they emphasized that. But he said, to keep people from being unclean or ritually impure, they would whitewash the tombs. Everybody would know where the tombs were, so you don't get too close to the tomb. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Just top of my head. Jews reject Christ.
Right.
So at what point did they start all their ceremonial laws?
A lot of this happened, interestingly enough, it happened much the same way in the Babylonians, but also when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. A lot of it happened then. So they started to adapt things. Remember, the synagogue started between the Testaments, right, but it happened because the temple was destroyed. So they were still trying to maintain their ethnicity, and they're still trying to maintain their worship of God by starting the synagogues. Now, they actually didn't offer the sacrifices and everything. When they rebuilt the temple, they did offer the sacrifices again, but what happened in AD 70? The Romans tore the place apart. So, once again, they stopped doing that way.
Yeah, I understand that, but the thing, what I'm saying here is that, okay, we know Christ fulfilled the law.
Right.
It's nailed to the cross.
Right.
It's over.
Right.
That system is over.
Right.
So when you reject him, how did you stop that system, the practice of that system? I mean, okay, Christ came, he did what he had to do.
Mm-hmm.
So what spiritual event took place to make them stop doing all the ceremony? But they should be still doing it.
They should be, but they're
Because
not.
nobody, I mean.
That's right.
Well, let me say this to a certain degree. You have what you call a Messianic Jew. A Messianic Jew is Jews who believe in the Messiah,
Mhm.
just like you and I do. Then you have what they call the Orthodox Jew,
Right.
who still keep some of those traditions where they just believe in the Old Testament, the Torah, the Pentateuch, or whatever it may be,
Mhm.
and still practice certain ritualistic things of that
Right.
that system back then. So you have you now just call the person a Jew doesn't mean you got Messianic Jews out there that would tell you Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior.
Oh, I understand the Messianic Jews, but the point I'm trying to make, what spiritual event took place to do away with all that?
Well, just like Thomas said, I think what happened, if I make safe this time,
Mhm.
what happened, you got to realize under the Babylonian, the Roman, those people came they came displaced. It's
Mhm.
just like if I come in your house, you got a system going on. When I come and occupy your house, I'm disrupting your system because I got loyalty for you. And then if I displace you from your land and take you to Babylon, take you here, take you there, the Syrians, the Babylonians, and all this and that stuff. Wasn't under Nehemiah when the king allowed Nehemiah to go back and build a wall and
Right.
do certain things?
Yeah.
Right.
So you got to realize
Yeah.
those people, it wasn't like when Jesus left, they was cool in that land by themselves. Like they come and said, the Romans came and occupied it and took
Yeah,
over.
Yeah.
And they were not allowed to
But
sacrifice
I
anything
tell you
else.
what, put it this way:
Yeah.
you're a black man, right?
Yeah.
You were from Africa, right?
Okay.
The European came and got you. So now, is it possible for you to trace what your people were doing back there in Africa? Because they were taken from a land like the Jews were taken.
Yeah. I
So
understand.
you're not. There may be remnants of that stuff going on
Mhm.
under the Orthodox Jews and stuff that they, but in the fullness of a system, no, they can't disrupt that system.
But here's the thing. I understand what you're saying. I understand about certain cultural things that was eliminated because of captivity and all this other thing. However, history is right here.
Right.
So even with all what you said, and the history is here, what spiritual event took place to make them stop? I could have been, captured by the Medes, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Romans. However, when I open up this Bible as a Jew, I see my history. Who told me to stop the sacrifices if I rejected Jesus?
Well, and again, that's part of it. As he was
That's what
pointing
I'm
out, and
saying.
as I'm pointing out, the Romans would have forbid them to have any more
Mhm.
sacrifices
Yeah.
because of that. So what they did a lot of times is they would do like a lot of people do, they adapted.
Yeah.
Go back and read, go through, and I challenge you to do this. I wanted to do this one time, but we just didn't have the class time. But if you really want something interesting, look up on YouTube how they observe the Passover. Everything on that plate represents something.
Mhm.
Everything on that plate represents something. And while they may not sacrifice a lamb like they would have under the Old Testament law, what they eat on that plate reminded them of how they were supposed to eat that lamb. So go back and look at that. They adapted it. And while they're not offering, quote, blood sacrifices today,
Yeah.
they're doing it in their mind by using this particular point as symbolic of what they would have been doing otherwise.
And Tom, I know you got to move on and let it
Yeah.
go after this. Was that king built Josiah when they had laws, the book of the law, and somebody
Right.
found it?
Right.
Okay.
It was
Yeah.
laws.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
wasn't doing them saying. He rented his clothes.
Right.
I mean, more than that part of what they were about was lost.
Did Ezra
And you got to realize,
find
too,
it, or?
just like you.
No, it was during the
Yeah.
time of Josiah. Ezra was
You gotta
much
realize
later.
that
Ezra did try to
generation
come back and
came from
reinstitute.
that generation. There was a less and less of that stuff because
Yeah.
the people who were doing it, they done died out now.
Yeah.
So
So it's good points. I mean, it's very, very good points. And I think the point that you're trying to make, with the coming of Jesus, the sacrificial system pretty well died, okay?
Yeah.
Simply because He died on the cross.
Right.
Right. But the Jewish, and a person that was very faithful to Judaism, they kept on sacrificing until AD 70 when that temple was totally destroyed. They kept on sacrificing. So then what they began to do is they went back to the synagogue, and they would not have, and again, you will read some and you will hear some places in Africa and some other places where they still sacrifice animals. Okay? And they call themselves Jews, and they're still sacrificing the animals and everything.
And you're right,
So-
Thomas. They done discovered it because they try to say that part of the lost tribes of Israel, those tribes, there's some people in Africa that still maintain some of those Jewish customs because they said they are part of the last tribe, and
Right.
it was handed down from them from generation to generation.
So you still have some of that. But again, I see your point in trying to make, and that's the thing. When Christ died, they did away with the whole system. And now they're having to do it. Why? Well, if you don't believe he's the Christ, you've got to keep going back to that system, and you've got to do it some way, somehow or another.
Yeah.
So like I said, read or see some of those videos on YouTube and see how these things represent certain things that they were
that's
supposed
what I
to
was trying to make.
Yeah.
If you check Christ, then who stopped all that for you?
do. Yeah, right. Okay, so here was this idea. They were becoming unpurified by walking over these tombs. So they would whitewash the tombs. All righty. Beware, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, on chapter 23-29 now, because you have built the tombs of the prophets and adorned the monuments of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers of the blood of the prophets. But, he says, you are the sons of the murderers of the prophets, okay? And he says, fill then up your measure of your father's guilt. In fact, they're going to go further. This group of people is going to kill Messiah. So he was greater than a prophet. And he says, so he just really tells them, he calls them snakes. You bunch of snakes. You brood of vipers. Vipers is what? A very deadly snake that would bite you and create problems. So he says, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of Abel, that goes back to Genesis 4, verse 8, to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. And you remember, I emphasized to you, the last book in the Jewish Bible is 2 Chronicles. It's not Malachi. The way they combine their Bible together is something else. So what Jesus is saying is from Genesis 4, when Cain killed Abel, to 2 Chronicles, the Bible starts with a murder and it ends with murder. The Old Testament does, their way of thinking. And he says, all of that blood that has been shed by you for all these prophets is going to come upon your head because you're killing Messiah. He says, all these things shall come, and in my Bible, I underline this, verse 20 or 36, all these things will come upon this generation. Now that's very important because if we continue to look in Matthew chapter 24, and as we start seeing the prophecies about what's going on there, Jesus is pronouncing condemnation to that generation. And then he's going to go from there to he's talking about something they will see in their lifetime, the destruction of Jerusalem, and compares it to what it's going to be at the end of time. So I want to keep that in mind. And again, key in on this idea, it's upon that generation. That blood was going to be upon them. And again, here's where I think that Jesus is weeping. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. And this is a quote from Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 7, and again in 22, verse 5. He says, I say to you, you will see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's his last sermon in the temple. He now leaves the temple. All righty? And as he's leaving, he sits out there opposite the treasury to see how much people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came in and threw in 2 mites. The mite is the word lepton. It's the least valuable of all the coins of the Jews. So it would be our penny, okay?
Yeah.
What can you buy with a penny nowadays? It costs the mint more to make them than it does that they're worth, okay? That's the bottom line. So there's no penny candy anymore, right? So there you go. So he says, this lady threw in 2 mites. This was worth, according to some scholars, 1/4 to 1/10 or 1/5 of a cent of a penny. All right, this was the smallest thing that there was. And he says, assuredly, this poor widow has put in more than all those who've given to the treasury. They put in all of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had, her whole livelihood. And that speaks to us about giving, doesn't it? And again, he's looking at this whole situation and judging what's going on here. So now he departs from the temple. We're now back at Matthew 24. Matthew 24. Those parallel passages in Mark 13 and Luke 21. As he departed from the temple, and this to me is a very important, the next section is very important for us to really grasp and understand. Okay, because again, a lot of people take these passages out of context and make them say some things that I don't think Jesus was trying to say. So his disciples came up to him. Now, put yourself in the disciples' place for just a moment. Jesus had pronounced a condemnation beyond me. He told it like it was, and he told them, you're going to go to hell. And but this is going to be his last words, his last-ditched effort to try to save them. And, of course, it probably made, like Pharaoh and Moses, their heart that much harder. All right? So he's leaving the temple for the last time, and the disciples were sitting around there listening to all this, and they're probably looking around seeing some angry faces. I'm being what's the word I'm looking for? This doesn't even begin to describe how angry they are, okay? And so you want to be awkward. Okay, so we're leaving the temple. Jesus, look at these big, beautiful rocks. Look at what Herod has used to build this temple. Man, aren't they great? Isn't that beautiful? And he says they show him all the buildings. Well, it's not like he hadn't seen it already. I think they're trying to break the ice. I think they're trying to break the awkwardness of the whole situation. So isn't this place beautiful? Maybe Luke emphasizes the idea it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations and gold and all these things like that. And he says, do you see this? And Jesus said, do you see all these things? Mark says, all these great buildings, not one stone shall left be here upon another, that shall not be thrown down. You're talking about the destruction of the temple, Lord. So as he came to the Mount of Olives, Mark 13 says this is opposite the temple. So he's coming to the Mount of Olives. He says, this really bothers them. Okay, Lord, when will this be? Now, notice there's 3 questions here. When will this be? Now, what had Jesus just finished telling them? There shall not be left one stone upon another. All right, when will these things be? Secondly, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? He's answering here, in essence, I think, 3 questions. When will this temple be destroyed, as you just talked about? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, put yourself in the Jews' place. They had already had the temple destroyed during Babylonian times, and they had been in Babylonian captivity, and they remembered, or their parents, and they knew their history about how bad things were then as a people. Lord, you're saying it's going to happen again? Herod the Great, as I said, was doing his best to build that temple back. And in less time than it took him to build the temple, it was about to be destroyed. And to a Jew, the destruction of the temple also meant the what? The end of their world as they knew it. Because they had already been through it with Babylon. They were about to go through it again and with Rome. So to them, the destruction of the temple is the same as the end of the world. Yeah. I want to keep that in mind. Because as we go through this passage very closely, we will see that Jesus will give signs. And then all of a sudden, in about verse 35 or 36, he talks about when he comes again. And all of a sudden, there's no signs at all. So I want you to see this is how it's really broke down here. All right? He said, take heed that no one deceives you. Number one, there's some things they could know about. Many will say, come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Now, you remember back in Acts chapter 22, when Paul had been arrested, the Roman soldier asked him, are you one of those guys that led in the revolt against Rome? He said, no, I'm from Cyprus, and I am a Jew. I deserve to be here. So you see, there were a lot of people at that time that claimed to be the Christ. There's still a lot of people today that claim to be this Christ.
Yeah.
Okay, so just keep that in mind.
You know, I know right what we're reading applies to this time period right here.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I'm on YouTube and, discussing Christ's return with people.
Right.
And they'll say, well, Christ came to me in the night. Well, he appeared to me, or he came to me while I was asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that contradicts the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Because if he came back and he talked to you or appeared to you and left,
mm-hmm.
then he left his church.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if he came and talked to you and left, now he's coming back a third time.
Mm-hmm.
So when they say stuff like this, it's out of ignorance because, I said, what you're saying contradicts Scripture.
Right, it does. And again, I think this has to be pointed out again. But notice he said there's going to be a lot of people saying I'm the Christ and will deceive many. He said you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Again, back in those days when they had wars, they're not like today where we try to have a war and get it over with in 30 or 60 days, Their wars would last years, 10, 15 years. You've heard of the 100-Year War? Okay. And they had no problem with that. They had no problem with that. So he said, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. So he's telling them there's some signs they can look forward to whenever the Jerusalem temple was going to be destroyed. You will hear signs of wars and rumors of wars, all right? Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famine, pestilences, fearful signs, according to Luke 21, and great signs from heaven, earthquakes in various places. And he said these are just the beginning of sorrows, not the end of it, not the end of time. This is just the beginning of it. And he says they shall lay their hands on you. Now, what does that mean? Well, in scriptures, it suggests the idea of arresting you and putting you in prison. Context. Always look at the context. They will deliver you up to tribulation. Mark says in Mark 13, he said, they will deliver you to councils and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You'll be brought before rulers and kings for my sake for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. Whatever's given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit. So there's the kind of tribulation that's going on. What? Bringing them into synagogues, beating them, brought before rulers and kings. Okay? He says they will betray one another. Luke adds, you'll be betrayed even by parents, by your brothers, by your relatives, by your friends. They'll put some of you to death. And you'll be hated for my name's sake. But he says, not a hair of your head will be lost. By your patience, possess your souls. The word patience comes from two different Greek words. This is translated in the English. One of the words is hupomone, to bear up under. Okay, that's the word that's used here. By your endurance, a lot of times in some of the newer translations, translated by your endurance, by you bearing up whatever you've got to deal with. That's how you shall possess your soul. And again, the way the word is used in the Greek in this particular place, you possess your souls. One way you could translate it, you possess for yourselves your souls. In other words, it's going back and forth from you. You are taking care of yourself by bearing up under these things. He's talking about a life of suffering. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness, what is lawlessness? It's breaking the law, but it's sin. Sin is lawlessness. Will abound, the love of many will grow cold. It's easier to go along to get along, right? Yeah. Okay? But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel in the kingdom will be preached in all world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Paul will say in Romans 10:13 that the gospel was preached to the world at that time. It went throughout the whole world. The gospel had gone through. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, back in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, 11th chapter, verse 31, and chapter 12, verse 11, Daniel had talked about the abomination of desolation. If you read that very closely and look at it from a historical viewpoint, there was a time when, after Alexander the Great died, 4 of his generals took over his kingdom. There was the king, the Seleucids, and then there was the Ptolemies. The Seleucids took over Babylon, Persia, that area. The Ptolemies took over Egypt. So when the king of the north, as you read through Daniel chapter 9, 10, 11, the king of the north and the king of the south come together and fight. Where are they fighting over? Jerusalem. That whole land there. Now, one of the kings of the north, name was Antiochus Epiphanes. He came down there and he was going to do all he could to stamp out culture everywhere and make everybody a Greek. Period. So he got down there. There was a guy there by the name of Mattathias who was the priest, and he demanded the soldiers, the king had been gone for a little bit, and the soldiers there demanded that Mattathias offer a pig on the altar. And that was the ultimate desecration. And he actually had done that. And so he commanded this Jewish priest to do that. And he said, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to do it. And killed the envoy of the king. This started the Maccabean War. You read about this in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. All right? So this abomination of desolation referenced that situation in Daniel, where that pig had been offered on an altar. He's saying that once again, the Romans are going to desecrate this temple. Just like it was in the days between the Testaments, so it shall happen again. So when you see this, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Jesus is giving the Christians warning. Get out of town. When you see these signs happening, when you see these things take place, get out of town. Let him who's on the housetop not go down and take anything out of the house. In other words, get out as quick as you can. Let not whom is in the field go and get back his clothes. Luke adds here in Luke chapter 21, verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know its desolation is near. Again, study the history going on right there at that time. Vespasian had been prosecuting the war against the Jews during the time of 68 and 69 AD. There were 3 guys that tried to take over the Roman government: Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Roman Senate said enough's enough. They called back Vespasian. Vespasian comes back. He becomes the Roman emperor. His son, Titus, the prince, Daniel chapter 9, prosecutes the war and destroys the city. Again, as I mentioned to you before, Josephus said the city was under siege for 160-something days. Close to 600,000 Jews were killed. So he says, Woe to those who are pregnant and nursing baby in those days. It's going to be it's hard to flee for your life, but you got to take a baby with you. And you got to find food. And you got to nurse the baby. I mean, it's it. Woe to you. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Again, Jewish law. And some of the Jews at that time, they would be willing to die rather than break the Sabbath law. So pray that it may not happen then. There will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor shall ever be. Mark says, since the creation. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh should be saved, but for the elect's days, those will be shortened. He's still giving them signs they can look for. The army surrounding the city. The love of many waxing cold. Being brought and tried. He says, so if anyone says, look, here's Christ, or there, do not believe it. False Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive even the very elect. Interestingly enough, he says, Luke 21, he said there'll be great distress in the land and wrath upon his people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles till the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Who would be the Gentiles? The Roman armies. False Christ, so he says they will deceive the very elect. I told you beforehand. So if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Look, he's in the inner courts, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west. We've all seen the storms. Maybe we may get some tonight. Okay? Atlanta's just wonderful about that right now at this time of year, right? So just deal with it. He says, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So it's quick. The coming is going to happen just like that. Now, what is he talking about when he says the coming of the Son of Man? Coming and judgment upon Jerusalem. The AD 70 destruction of Jerusalem. He hasn't changed that yet. I want to emphasize that. So after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. Now, a lot of times, this passage, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will shake. This was used again in prophetic language in Daniel to talk about the destruction of a nation. It's not talking about the destruction of the whole world at this time. It's talking about the destruction of a nation. And what nation was going to be destroyed? The Jewish nation. Why? They rejected Messiah. So he emphasizes, he says, this whole idea of the sun and the moon, and go back and read Isaiah, that same figure is used, where sometimes the king is compared to the sun, and his princes are compared to the stars, and the moon would be the woman, okay, the queen. So you see this figure used a lot of times in the Old Testament. The Jews would have understood every one of these figures because it's found over and over and over again in the Old Testament. In Daniel chapter 8, it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. There's another passage. But again, he's not talking about the stars being trampled to the ground, but what? The end of the nation. The princes are destroyed. All the chief priests, they're going to be destroyed. Then the Son of Man will appear in the sign of heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The Son of Man, of course, that sounds like Christ, obviously, right? He's often used that phrase. A lot of times in Mark he uses that phrase. But does it necessarily mean that everybody's going to see him at that moment in time and it's going to be a judgment of the whole world? No. God had, again, in the Old Testament, used a lot of these very same figures to talk about him judging a nation. Go back and read Isaiah. Go back and read Jeremiah, where he would judge Babylon, where he judged Assyria, where he judged Egypt, where he judged Tyre and Sidon and the Amalekites and all these others. And he would talk about God coming. Well, this doesn't mean that he's actually coming on the land, but he's using other nations to what? Judge his people. So again, the Jews will understand every bit of this imagery. And so then he says he will send his angels with the sound of a great trumpet and gather together his elect from the four winds. Again, this is poetic, figurative language. And now I want you to notice as we go down here, He said, look at this. He said, these Jewish tribes, Zechariah chapter 12, verse 12 is another one of those passages. He would say in Luke chapter 21, verse 28, when these things begin to happen, look up and lift your heads, for your redemption draws near. So he didn't tell us the parable of the fig tree. And you remember the only time he ever destroyed something on earth was what? A fig tree. They would have remembered that because it was that same week. When he mentioned fig tree, do you think the disciples automatically thought, oh yeah, didn't he destroy that? He said, when the branches become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. When you see these things, know that it is near. This generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. You remember Matthew 23? All these things shall happen upon this generation. Now he again says, this generation. And a generation at that time would be within 40 years. And literally within 40 years, that's exactly what happened. So then Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will no means pass away. Now look in verse 36. You remember the questions earlier in Matthew 24? When will these things be? The sign of your coming and the end of the world, or the age. As I mentioned before, if you were a Jew and you saw that Jerusalem destroyed again, that would be the end of your world, wouldn't it? But you see, and he was giving them signs. What are some of the signs? Boy, I'm telling you, false prophets, the wars and rumors of wars, famines and pestilences and earthquakes and all the things he's talking about, the cities surrounded by armies, they would understand that. But then he says this. What's their third question? In the end of the age. He said, of that day, an hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. You see, even Jesus will say, I don't know when I'm coming again. My Father knows. When my Father tells me to go get my church, to go get my bride, I'm going to go get my bride. He says, as the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. As in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, till the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now Noah was a preacher of righteousness. 1 Peter chapter 2 at verse 5. I think that's a passage. So it emphasizes the idea that he preached probably for that 120 years. Noah, what you doing? I'm building an ark. What's an ark? Well, God said there's going to be a flood. What's a flood? You know? So, you know. Yeah, that's right. That's the point. It never rained. It hasn't rained since that time like that. There's no way in the world it would have done that. So the point is, he's trying to preach to them, but the only people he saves is his family. So he said, what were they doing? They were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage. The flood came and took them all the way. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what time it is. Mark chapter 13, 33 and 34. It's like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Luke says, take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come upon you second. You see, we can get so involved with the world that what? We don't think about. Now, I want to ask you a question, and nobody has to answer this, but I want you to think about it. Did you wake up this morning thinking today could be the day? Most of us don't. Let's be honest about it. But it's the truth, right? And so if we woke up every morning thinking today could be the day, would that help me in my manner of life? When I spend a little more time in prayer, when I spend a little bit more time in study, when I look around me about all the things I've got to do today, and when I realize what's really important, what's not. None of us know when our last day on earth is going to be. So it's not just for the Lord's coming, but also just for our death. If the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Be ready. For the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you do not expect. You see, contrast that with what he's been saying about the destruction of Jerusalem and giving them a bunch of signs, but now all of a sudden he's saying what? There's not going to be any sign. There's not going to be any warning. It's just going to happen. Who is a faithful and wise servant whom his master made ruler over his household? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. I will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master's delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he's not looking for him, and an hour when he's not aware, and will cut him in two and point his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Chapter 25. Here's another one of those passages where I know why the Bible is divided in chapters and verses, but they should have never divided it here. Okay? This is just a continuation of this. Get his point across even that much more. He starts telling the parable of the 10 virgins. Let's take a 5-minute break and come right back. Okay? Yeah. Okay, we come back to Matthew 25. Again, as I mentioned earlier, right before the break, this is one of those sad tragedies where the Bible was broken into chapters and verses. Okay, so keep that in mind. The kingdom of heaven, he says, we've talked about the kingdom a lot, the kingdom of heaven being the church. And that's what's interesting about these next few parables, okay? He's going to talk specifically in these parables about the relationship of the church to the end of the world. So he says, the kingdom of heaven shall be like unto 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. That's right. Those foolish took their lamps, but no oil. But the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. It was the time of the wedding. Now, it's interesting that Jesus will inspire Paul to write about the idea of Ephesians chapter 5, and Jesus being the head of the church being the bride. So he's using the same figure here with regards to his coming again. And he's trying to tell the church, you need to be ready. He's been talking about the world, but now he's talking specifically about the church here. The wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps, but while the bridegroom delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And this was often the thing that they did at that time when they had weddings. The bridegroom would come maybe in the middle of the night. They would have that beautiful party and then consummate the marriage. So at midnight, the cry was heard. The bridegroom is coming, go out to meet him. All those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And some of the foolish said to the wise, give some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise said, no, lest should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves. All right, it's midnight. Who's going to be open at midnight? Well, it's not like they don't have racetrack and QT that's open 24 hours a day. Then they didn't have that. So what? They're up a creek. So they go out trying to buy something. And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. That's another one of those sad phrases that you read in the Bible, the door was shut. In other words, there's no getting in now. It's too late. That's it. So you see it again. The other virgins finally get their oil and said, Lord, come open to us. I do not know you. This is a warning to the church. Some are going to be ready, some aren't. So think about that. He goes on. The kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one, he gave 5 talents. A talent was a weight of measurement. Whenever it could be used for gold or silver. Again, he didn't specify, but it would be a large sum of money. All right. Some of the resources that I have, and again, depending on who you talk to, a talent could be up to 75 pounds. All right. So think about 75 pounds, 5 talent, 2 talent, 1 talent man. And again, he gave each one according to his own ability. The master knew the ability of the servant. So he immediately went on his journey. Those who had received 5 talents went and gained 5 more talents. And the 2-talent man had done the same thing. But when he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. So after a long time, notice the word is long time. It's been 2,000 plus years since the Lord's been here. So just keep that in mind. One day is with the Lord is what? 1,000 years. So just keep that in mind. The Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. He who had received 5 talents brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents besides them. The Lord said, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I'll make you ruler over many. Enter into the joy of your Lord. The joy of your Lord. The Lord's come back. So you should be joyous that he's come back. He gave 2 talents. Okay, the man who received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered me 2 talents, and I've gained 2 more talents besides them. Now, these guys obviously were industrious. They worked. They did what they needed to do. And again, one of the things that we do know is that God blesses our efforts. He does. But he expects us to make the effort. He's not just going to give it to us. He's going to give it to us according to our ability. He's going to give it, so we've got to enjoy that and use it. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll make you over ruler over many. Enter you into the joy of your Lord. Notice the idea of joy again. Joy is one of those things that we ought to have in our life, right? Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering. He who received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you'd be a hard man. When anybody starts off that way, it's kind of what? Okay, I'm going to make my excuses here. And the first excuse I make is, you're tough. Okay. You reap where you've not sown, gathered where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here is what's yours. And the Lord answered, you wicked and lazy servant. King James is slothful. You wicked and lazy servant. You knew I reap where I did not sow and gathered where I've not scattered seed. You've ought to at least deposited my money to the bankers, so I'd at least got a little bit of interest off of it. You didn't do that. Take the talent from him and give it to the 10 talent. And everyone who has, more will be given. He will have abundance, but from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. Cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay. Both of these are to the church, to the kingdom. Okay. Notice again, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. So now we find the final judgment scene. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him. He'll separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. He'll set the sheep on his right hand and the goats on the left. And the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. God's plan for the church was from before the foundation of the world. Read Ephesians 1 and 3. The church makes known the manifold wisdom of God. Now notice, he says, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. He says, I was in prison and you came to me. And the righteous will say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink, or a stranger and take you in, naked and clothed? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? He said, inasmuch as you did in one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. He will say to those on the left hand, depart from me into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Unrighteous men is going to go to a place that was prepared specifically for the devil, right? It's everlasting. Why? You know, there's a theory out there some people have, well, there's no such thing as hell. And number two, the second theory is, well, if there is such a place as hell, God's going to throw the people's souls down in there and they're going to be destroyed. Why then do you have an everlasting fire? Is it going to take forever to burn all the people that's been alive? I don't know. I don't think so. I was hungry and you gave me no food, thirsty and you gave me no drink, stranger and you did not take me in, naked and you did not clothe me, and in prison and you did not visit me. And I said, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or stranger or naked or sick or in prison and you did not minister to you? Surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go into everlasting, there's that word again, everlasting punishment, right? Why is there an everlasting punishment? Why is there everlasting fire if it's not a place of torments, as we've cited in Luke chapter 16? But the righteous shall go into life eternal. This is a passage, as I said before, that needs to be more and better understood, simply because of the many false doctrines that are out there nowadays. So again, let's listen to what Jesus had to say about it. Let's be prepared. We go on to Matthew 26. When Jesus had finished all these things, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. And the chief priests and scribes and the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest. Again, who was the high priest then? Caiaphas, right. And plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Then Satan entered Judas, or surnamed Iscariot, who was a number among the 12. How did Satan enter him? Obviously, he led him. Yeah. Obviously, that need for that gold or whatever was more needful than anything else. So he went his way, and how he, to the chief priests and captains, how he might betray him to them. Matthew tells us that Judas said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they bargained for 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver, according to Zechariah verse 9, or chapter 9, was the price of a slave. And that's what that's what Judas felt like Jesus was worth. That's what he bargained for. And they were glad. They've been trying to get him in every which way they could, but they couldn't. The only way it seems like that they could do this is by what? By hook and trickery. Betrayal. And betrayal of Judas. So he sought an opportunity to betray them in the absence of the multitude. This is now Wednesday. Okay? In Luke chapter 22. Wednesday would have been a day of rest leading up to Thursday's preparation day. Preparation day would have happened again on that day before. And again, this is what they had to do. Go back and read again Exodus 12, 13, 14, where he talks about the Passover. So came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. Matthew says it's the first day of the feast of unleavened bread. They came to Jesus and they asked a question. They said, where do you want us to go to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Again, go back and study some of the Jewish rituals at this time. They had to make sure that the house had no leaven in it whatsoever. None. And so what would happen is the priest would go and check everybody's house in the city. They would send out deputations, and he would look. I mean, you want to talk about, I could see, I see women really getting their house spick and span. But can you imagine the ladies at that time going through that to get rid of all the leaven? You want to talk about clean. And they actually would go through a ritual at that time. They would, again, look at all of these things. They would look everywhere for any bit of leaven. And then at the end, the priest would go out of the house and say, okay, this house is declared clean of leaven. Let it go. And then what? He would declare it clean, and therefore they could eat the Passover in that house. So they said to him, where do you want us to prepare? And they said, when you've entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house in which he enters. Now, this was odd. Most of the women would be the ones carrying the water. All righty? Remember who was at the well getting the water in John 4? It was a Samaritan woman, okay? So, Most men would not be carrying the water, so they say to the master of the house, Teacher, the teacher says to you, where's the guest room that I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And going to Matthew 26, he adds this point. The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. So obviously this, and notice this is the upper room. This is where they're going to meet. This is where the disciples are going to stay in the city of Jerusalem after the resurrection. This is where Jesus is going to show himself to them. So this was a very important place, a very important section at this time. So he will show you a large furnished upper room there, make ready. This was a man of wealth and position. He was a large room. It was already furnished. Did Jesus already make preparations? May very well have. We don't know exactly how it all worked out, but I'm sure, Jesus had it and they found it prepared just as he said it was going to be. Now, when the hour had come, the hour had come for the Passover. And this is, like I said, the next few, what we're looking at, this is where it's going to go. So the Paschal lamb would have been killed. Now, they would have prepared for this already 10 days before. They would have cleaned this lamb out because, according to Exodus chapter 12, every part of the lamb was supposed to be roasted. You had to have a lamb big enough to feed your family. If your family was big, you might kill 2 lambs. If it wasn't, then you might share it with somebody, a smaller family. But it had to be enough to feed the family. They would also prepare the bitter herbs. The bitter herbs would remind them of their bitter suffering in Egypt. The unleavened bread reminds them again of the fact that they had to get ready to flee. They didn't have time for the bread to rise, okay? And so then they had a reddish sweet compote of fruit, which again emphasizes the idea of red, suggested the idea. And again, go back and read some of these things on YouTube. Watch some of this stuff. It would remind them of their bitter suffering. It would also remind them of the bricks they were making in Egypt. Everything, and it goes back to what you were talking about earlier, brother, how a lot of these things then took on different meanings. They would not actually kill a lamb, but they would have a leg bone of some animal there to remind them of the lamb that they should have been eating there. Okay, the red compote made of the fruit and so forth would have reminded them of the bricks and the blood. Okay, so you see all of these things represented something. The Passover lamb was to be slain in the evening of the 14th of Nisan, also called the month of Aviv, at the going down of the sun. So between the evenings, now what does that mean? The Hebrew actually has between the evenings in the Hebrew in Exodus and Deuteronomy. So they preferred that what they're referring to is between the time frame of 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening. Okay? Later that evening, all the lamb had to be eaten. And whatever was left over, what had to happen to that? It had to be burned. Okay? They were not to leave any part of the lamb there. So when the hour had come, that hour is getting close to it. He says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Now remember, this Passover always represented salvation, deliverance. Now when Jesus died upon the cross, we partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week to remind ourselves of what Jesus did. Every year, they were supposed to eat of this Passover. We partake every first day of the week. God knows, God knows we need to be reminded, right? There was a dispute among the disciples as to which of them would be considered the greatest. So even here, they're still arguing amongst themselves as to who's going to be the greatest. And again, this was probably over seating arrangement. In Luke chapter 9, 40 through 50, and 46 through 50, and Matthew 20, we've already seen this. So he says, the king of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. Those who exercise authority over them are their benefactors. But it shall not be so among you. He who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger. He who governs is he who serves. So who is greater, the one who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. So this is where we pick up with John 13. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew his hour has come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And the supper being ended, the devil already having put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. I want to emphasize the idea Judas had a choice, right? Did Judas have a choice?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So keep that in mind. Jesus, knowing the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from his supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he's washing his disciples' feet. That was the job of the lowliest servant. They didn't have shoes like we have today, and they didn't have paved roads. They were dusty roads. So you would walk into a place, and the first thing that would happen is you would kind of wash up a little bit, get all that dust off of you. A servant would be there to wash your feet at the table. And that would be a cool, refreshing time. But instead of them serving one another, they're too worried about who's going to take first, so they're not going to serve one another. So Jesus takes his robe off, puts a towel on, and begins to wash his disciples' feet. Do you think that probably amazed them? Yeah. Do you think that that was probably something that surprised? Yeah, and so they're doing this, and they probably are sitting there thinking to themselves, well, I really wish I hadn't been arguing about who's going to be first, who's going to be second here. You know, that kind of embarrassed me a little bit there. Now the Lord is serving us. He came to Peter, and Peter said, Lord, are you washing my feet? And Jesus answered and said, what I'm doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. And Peter said, no, you're never going to wash my feet. Peter's always talking. He's always talking. Okay. And he says, you're not going to wash my feet. Jesus said, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. And then it's like, oh, well, Lord, you got to say this about Peter. He loves the Lord. Mm-hmm. He really loves the Lord. He said, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Well, then, Lord, if you're going to wash me, then not only my feet, but my hand and everything else about me. No. He who is bathed only needs to wash his feet. You are clean, but not all of you. And he knew what Judas was about to do. So he said, you are not all clean. So when he washed their feet, taken his garments and sat down, he said, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say so, for so I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. In other words, you need to serve in whatever way you can. I know nowadays we don't wash folks' feet when they come in the house, right? No, that would. In fact, if we started doing something like that, they'd probably sit back and look at us and say, boy, these people, I'm beginning to worry about these folks here a little bit, you know? But that whole idea of service is what he's talking about. Paul will tell the young preacher Timothy in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20, he says this. Okay, all right. I'm sorry, 5 verse 10. He's talking about widows. Widows, one of the characteristics of these widows that were taken care of by the saints was what? She has shown hospitality and has washed the feet of saints. 1 Timothy chapter 5 at verse 10. She has cared for the afflicted and devoted herself to every good work. So it's interesting that even Paul would talk about this to Timothy, and the widows that were to be taken care of were these widows that were willing to serve. Isn't that interesting and isn't that great? So he says, you ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. And most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, neither he who is sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I do not speak concerning all of you, but I know whom I've chosen, that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. So I tell you before it comes, that you may know, that you may believe that I am. And notice again, if you're looking in the text, that word I am he is italicized. So again, there's that phrase again, I am, all right? Whoever I send receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. He takes his opportunity here to show his disciples, his servants, that we must be servants. That's it. Amongst those people who are always fighting about who's going to be the greatest. Is there a lesson for us? Yes, absolutely. Now, John tells us, and this becomes interesting again, because as you're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John about the crucifixion, again, we start seeing some things happening here in the background. The question is, and there is a huge question here, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more right here at this particular place. It emphasizes, as you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's account of this situation, the question is, was Judas there when he gave the Lord's Supper? In other words, when he took the Passover meal and turned it into the thing about the Lord's Supper, was Judas there? Some commentators say he was. This commentator says he wasn't. Okay? And let me just show you, I think, the chronology of events. When I say this commentator, I'm saying this is my opinion, so I want you to study it yourself. I did a 20-page term paper in my master's class on this in the Synoptic Gospels. If you want to read it, I can send it to you. Okay, so it's something to look at. So he'd washed his disciples' feet. I think what John does is he takes us back right before they actually started eating the Passover meal. Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Then Jesus was troubled in spirit and says, I say to you, one of you shall betray me. The disciples looked at one another, perplexed about whom he spoke. Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. In all probability, and by the way, this is always referencing John. And again, you got to remember that it wasn't like the Lord's Supper, like Michelangelo pictured, where everybody's sitting around the table. They were all around a low table. They were reclining on cushions. Jesus would wash their feet. So he says, I say to you, one of you shall betray me. Then the disciples looked at one another, perplexed about whom he spoke. And they were leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. And so Peter motioned to John, who was leaning as it was on Jesus' bosom, where all he would have had to do is he would have had to just lean back and say, Lord, who is it? You know, and that's about what it would have boiled down to.
It looks like here he was there.
Huh? That's right. That's right here. But let me keep showing you, okay? Let's keep looking. So leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said, Lord, who is it? It is he whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it. And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Now, remember there's two events happening here. There's actually the Passover event. And at the end of the meal, from what we read in Luke's account, we will find that after that, well, let's just look at Luke's account very quickly. I hope I can get this explained to you in the next few minutes. And I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it's something to wrestle with a little bit. In Luke's account, and again, to understand this really, you've got to go back to see the whole idea of the Passover. Okay, look in Luke chapter 22. It came the day of unleavened bread on which Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So he sent Peter and John And when the hour came, he reclined at table, and the apostles were with him. And he said, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup. Now, go back and look at some of these Passover celebrations. Are you with me? It's Luke 22. We're beginning at verse 14. He wants to study, or he wants to eat the Passover. They had 4 cups of wine. What happened is the president of the feast, which would usually be the father, because again, this would be a family celebration. He would take, there would be one big cup that had the wine in it. And what he would do is pour out a little bit of wine to all the people around the table. So he would start off with this first cup of wine. They would partake of that, say the blessing. And as you read this and you see this through the Passover, they actually have 4 times when they're partaking of the wine. All right? Has it ever been confusing to you as you look at this in Luke's account? So he says, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave to them, saying, this is my body. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup is poured out for you, that a new covenant in my blood. That first cup is not the cup that he used to do that. It was that 4th cup, the end of the Passover meal. They would have these 4 cups, and at 4 different sections in the meal, they would all drink this together. That 4th cup would be the sign that the Passover meal was now over. Okay? So that's the reason why, Matthew, Mark, and John don't even mention the cup and then the partaking of the bread and then the cup. Luke is the only one that mentions that. So this is where the Passover celebration was over, that last cup. Then he took of that unleavened bread. He said, distribute it amongst yourselves. And then he took the cup again after they had eaten. Key in on that phrase, after they had eaten. And he said, this cup is poured out for you. This is the covenant in my blood. So now let's talk about some things. This is my body. What is this? That is a metaphor. Actually, a simile and a metaphor. All right? Simile is a comparison using like or as. A metaphor is just simply a stated comparison. So when he took of the bread, he said, this is my body. Now, again, some of our religious friends, the Catholics, says it actually becomes the actual body of Christ, right? No, it's a metaphor saying this is representative of my body, and it's a very strong metaphor, all right? Same thing with this is my cup, or this is the cup of my blood, all right? It's not actually blood. It didn't turn into blood, but it what? It's symbolic of it. This is my blood. So what I'm trying to get across to you is I think what happens is that, and I stress this is my thoughts. I want you to study it, all right? And you're probably saying, well, it really doesn't matter, but in one sense it might. To me it does, okay? But I think what happens is he gets down to this point and he gives them this last cup. And this is where Matthew and Mark and John says, what you do quickly. The Passover meal is over. He tells Judas, go do what you've got to do. So yeah, I think he did partake of the Passover meal, but I think he left after the Passover meal because, again, think about it in another respect. And here's something else to think about. The other disciples thought that Jesus told him to go buy and go help some of the poor, right? That's what they were thinking. Well, Judas would have never left during the middle of the Passover. So he left to go betray Jesus before Jesus gave instituted the Lord's Supper.
So you say, according to your opinion, you think that he left before the Passover meal began?
No, I think he left right after the Passover meal began or ended, and then before Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper.
Did you get this from Luke 22?
Luke 22:14. Notice again, after he had given thanks. Okay? So as you're looking at all the accounts, you kind of sit back and say, okay, what's going on here? Was Judas there or not? Now, here's something to think about. If Judas was there and partook of the institution of the Lord's Supper, that says one thing, doesn't it? But if he wasn't there, then I think Jesus specifically demanded or didn't want him there at that moment in time. I think also, this also explains John 13, whenever he goes back down and after Judas leaves, then what? Then Jesus starts talking about a lot of promises he makes that Judas was not going to receive. The promise of the Spirit. The promise of the Spirit, and so forth and so forth. So Judas, I think, left before this time. Now notice he said, listen, look in John 13. So I think what's happening is after the Passover. But Jesus had told them, okay, now I'm about to be betrayed. Peter, who is it? So he leaned back against Jesus. Luke chapter 13 said, Lord, who is it? Whoever I give this morsel of bread when I've dipped it. Now the morsel of bread, it's not like the baked bread. It's still that unleavened bread. Remember, there's no leaven in the house. What would he dip it in? Probably that fruit compote that I was talking about earlier. He would dip it and give it to Judas. And so therefore, what? John would know exactly who it was. Because, again, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, they didn't know. But when you read John's account, John knew. So you've got to try to put them all together. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to put all these things together as much as we possibly can. And then after this, no one at the table knew why he said this. Some thought that because Judas had the money bag, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. But after he received the morsel of bread, he immediately went out. And it's interesting that John says it's night.
Well, also, if you look at a principle, we know that today the Lord's Supper is for the saved. And nobody in sin has the authority or right to take part in the Lord's Supper.
Right.
So to stay with the principle,
right,
you can look at it from that point of view.
That's right.
Once the devil came into him, he was in sin. So therefore, he has no right to partake of that.
Right. And here's the point too, he still had a choice. All through this thing, his choice was not taken away. He had a choice. So as I said, I'm thinking that he partook of the Passover after that cup was over with, as we read in Luke chapter 22. Then he dips that bread, gives it to him, says, what you do quickly.
Also, he wouldn't have known that the Lord was going to institute the Lord's
No,
Supper.
he wouldn't have known at that moment in time. But after he was gone, the Lord did institute the Lord's Supper and all the events, and then everything from, like I said, from here all the way through John 16 until his arrest, where they meet up in the garden. Okay? All of those things take place. All righty? Y'all chew on that. If you want a copy of that paper, I'll send it to you.
Well, that's something to think about, because today, we in the church, if that's not the case here, we can't refuse. I mean, we're not going to refuse anyone.
Right.
But as far as having the authority to take it, if he had taken it, then anybody today has the authority to take it.
Yeah. So some things to think about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of implications to this idea.
I kind of disagree with you. Let me show you where. So, because you're not a discerner of the heart, you don't know the person next to you who has taken the Lord's Supper is right with God. That's not your place to call.
No.
What you're doing now, what I'm saying, that what you're saying. So that's why I disagree with you. So you got a person right next to you, singing right next to you, worshiping right next to you, whatever it may be. You don't know their heart. You don't know whether or not that person's been out sinning that night and just trying to show face. So that person partakes of that Lord's Supper. So you, looking at our part, don't really know what's going on, because God is concerned of the heart. So that's not a good thing, because what you're saying, everybody that partakes of the Lord's Supper is right with God.
No.
I disagree
But
with you.
here, where I disagree with you,
Well, I disagree with that.
Didn't mean to get into this disagreement,
Yeah, I
man,
know.
but you know what I'm
Yeah,
trying to say.
You're assuming I'm doing the judgment.
No. But you're saying,
Listen,
you're saying,
listen. Listen. I just presented a principle. I just presented something to think about.
Mhm.
You looking at it as I'm judging. I'm saying just take a look at it this way, you know, by God's authority, not mine. I'm not judging anybody. I'm looking at God, how Jesus set this up. And it's a possibility that looking at it from how Jesus set it up is something to think about. Now, I'm not going to sit next to somebody and say, oh, you can't take, no, I'm not going to do that. But when we look at this, it's something to think about. It's not me. I'm just thinking about how Jesus established it. And it's something to think about.
Well, when salvation is established in the Lord, there are people who are going to be right next to you who are not going to make it, but you may think they cool. You may think they all right with God. They're showing a lot of the tremors of it to you. In other words, what I'm saying, you was talking about the Lord's Supper and
so do sinners, according to what you believe, do sinners have the right?
No, because that's what you got to examine yourself.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying, a lot of people who are going to do the Lord's Supper could be faking it.
Years ago, let me say this. Hey, let me.
Okay, I'm not going to judge that.
Here we go.
Yeah,
Let me say this. There were years ago those that believed in closed communion. In other words, that if a person is not a Christian, then we're not going to give them the Lord's Supper. Okay. The idea, I think a lot of this comes into play, and I think that's where some of this does come into play there. Okay. And thinking about that idea. I think you're both right. We can't judge the person's heart. I don't think we're not judging one way or another. But one of the things we do need to stress, and I really do this, and this is kind of the way I like to, at South Ca, we have preaching and the offering the invitation before we do the Lord's Supper on Sunday morning. And the reason is I'm hoping that maybe the Lord will touch their hearts and they get everything straightened out before they do partake of the Lord's Supper. And again,
I think anybody when it comes to the Lord's Supper, not to take that lightly.
That's exactly right.
And I think there's always an opportunity given that a person examine themselves.
That's right.
That's everywhere. That a person examine themselves and not to be taken lightly at the Lord's Supper.
And I think sometimes, and again, one of the accusations made. So all of you are agreeing with that. That's good. And I think that's what we're saying, the same thing. We're just looking at it a slightly different way. Let me go ahead and make this statement as well.
I'm not in the judgment position. What I'm saying, I could kind of see when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, that it's not for sinners.
And that's true. I don't think I don't know if he was excusing Judas. I think it was just the providence of God where for Judas to do what he did. It was the time that he was to do what he did. Because you gotta realize Judas Iscariot did a lot of things. He had a position in the Lord's court. So he did a lot of things that there was a lot of participation in a lot of this. But he would never, even when Jesus said, he said, have not I picked trouble? One of you is a devil. He said at the beginning of the ministry. I think what's going on here, and I may be wrong, this is my thought. And I'm gonna let it go because I know you got to do some stuff. I think what's going on here is that God, he was showing that salvation is even unto the most vile person. If their heart is able to be touched and repent of their sin and accept Christ as Lord and Savior, even people like Judas Iscariot, because the Bible said the Lord wishes that no one should perish. Right. So to be fair with humanity, even people like Judas Iscariot had the opportunity to get it right before the Lord. Now Judas made his choice, but there's also others who are going to make that choice just like Judas, and they can be right in the church, right next to you, singing better than you. They can be right in the church teaching better than you. And so what I'm saying, is that God extends opportunity to humanity as a whole. Now, if humanity, if that individual in these key positions is not right with God, I don't care what church he ain't right with God from God's perspective.
Oh, I agree with all that.
Yeah.
Because it goes back to what you're saying, and the bottom line, you gotta be right with God.
That's it.
And
That's it.
one thing about using birth that I like, God's providence.
Yeah.
And to add to God's providence,
It's time for
I'm
Judas
going to say,
to go out.
under God's providence, Judas was not there when he instituted the Lord's Supper.
Mhm.
Well,
See, I think you both of you are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
You just thinking you're disagreeing with one another, but I don't see it. You know, I don't really see it here. I think we see what we're trying to say. And again, it says something to me. As I did that study, it said something to me that what both of you are saying and what I'm trying to say. Whenever we worship, we better have our heart, mind, and soul in what we're doing and knowing exactly what we're doing and exactly what
It's a
we're doing.
serious thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard people say, well, I need to go take my crackers and grape juice. And I'm sitting there like, oh, come on now. Just really, really, come on. You know, I've heard people say, well, I don't sing because I can't sing. Oh, no, I don't want to hear that either. That's because God told you to,
Right.
period.
Yeah.
You may not sing worth anything, but you better be singing because it's a command.
Yeah,
And whenever you partake of that,
those things should be taken lightly. Those are things that God Himself instituted
that's right.
for those who are saved. And
1 Corinthians 11 will stress this idea more, even that much more about making sure about our hearts and so forth like that. So that's a whole nother huge study that'll take another 3 hours to go through. But but I think it needs to be said. And I just challenge all of us to look at that. That's my opinion. And again, if anybody wants a copy of that, I'll be more than happy. So you can study it
I have
yourself.
a heavy plate. I really do. My
Yeah.
plate is so heavy.
Yeah.
There's so much I got going on in my life. But send that to me somewhere, sometime, one day.
Yeah.
I don't know when.
I'll just try to send it to everybody if everybody wants it.
When I get my time, I may have one of my theologian scholars to look at it. I got this brother who's a scholar. He can Greek and Hebrew. He can do all that stuff. But yeah, send that to me. I may have to probably pay him a couple of dollars to go for it. So,
Okay.
or I may look over it myself. You know,
Okay.
just give myself time to do it. It's gonna take a minute.
All righty. We'll stop there until next week. Thank you, guys. We have 2 weeks after this. The final will be the last day of class, and what I'm thinking about doing for my benefit. It's not necessarily going over everything that we've studied. Well, I'm going to go over a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask for essay questions so that I can know what you've learned. Okay? So please take it for your benefit.
I ain't got
So
no
you'll be
choice.
challenged. Well, yes, I know. There you go.
No choice but to take.
All righty. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for being
My
here.
plate is-
There you go.
I gotta take Tuesday. I gotta do some essay stuff for John.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I know.
So
Thank you guys so much. Folks in Oklahoma, thank you so much for taking this class. I appreciate it so much. It's still sunshiny there. It's already getting dark a little bit over here. So just, y'all take care. Appreciate you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
I would have
Rex, good to see you, man. Take care of yourself.
I know.
All right.
You know, my life.